Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Isaac. For more programming on our YouTube channel, please subscribe to the Jersey City Free Public Library YouTube channel by clicking subscribe. Or you can go to our main website at www.jclibrary.org, and under the calendar of events section, you can find out about more virtual programming like author talks, presentation, lectures, and panel discussions like today. Today, we have a panel discussion focusing on Black possibility, honoring the past, and envisioning the future. We have four panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Marcus D. Allen. Dr. Allen joined the faculty of Gutman Community College in 2013, rising to full professor of political science and urban studies in August 2016. His publications have appeared in the Journal of Race and Policy, Journal of Black Studies, and the American Review of Politics, among others. And he has presented at numerous conferences in his areas of expertise. Dr. Allen earned his PhD in political science from Binghamton University, State University of New York. Welcome, Dr. Allen.
Thank you, it's nice to be here.
Our second panelist is Dr. Carolyn Gordon. Dr. Gordon is the Associate Professor of Mass Communication at Mississippi Valley State University. Before relocated to MVSU, she taught at Fuller Theological Seminary as the Associate Professor of Communication and Chair of Preaching and Communication Department. Dr. Gordon earned her PhD in Human Communication Studies at Howard University. Welcome, Dr. Gordon.
Glad to be here.
Our third panelist.
Absolutely glad to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. Our third panelist is Dr. Clarissa Peterson. Dr. Peterson is a native of Steubenville, Ohio, is a professor of political science at DePaul University, where she teaches American politics and Africana studies. Professor Peterson joined DePaul University in 1997, where she has been a consistent force for issues of diversity and inclusion. She earned her BA from the University of Akron and her PhD from Emory University. Welcome, Dr. Peterson.
Thank you, glad to be here.
And our fourth and last panelist is Dr. Sean Anthony Christian. Dr. Christian lectures and publishes on 20th century African-American literature and print culture, especially during the Harlem Renaissance. He is the author of The Harlem Renaissance and the Idea of New Negro Reader. His other writings appeared in CLAJ, MAWA Review, Ethnic Studies Review, Legacy, a Journal of American Women Writers, and the volumes reading African-American Experiences in the Obama Era and the Harlem Renaissance Revisited. Dr. Christian earned his PhD from the University of Michigan. Welcome, Dr. Christian.
Thank you, it's a pleasure to be here.
So we're just gonna get in the first question. We'll start off with Dr. Allen. And the first question is, how do you honor Black history?
Well, I honor Black history every day. I understand that this month is one that is celebratory and signifies the importance of the world recognizing the accomplishments of the African diaspora. But when I get up in the morning, I recognize and I think of my ancestors. I think about those who have come before me that have laid the ground for me, and my role also in laying the ground for those young students that I deal with now for the past 18 years of my career. So for me, every day is Black history. But in terms of this specific this celebration for February, usually as an educator, I usually celebrate those things in the context of creating programming on campus, or obviously contributing to conversations like this to help share my love and perspective about the African diaspora.
Dr. Gordon, same question.
I think that should do it.
That's the Garrett. There you go.
I celebrate Black history in a lot of ways. And I'm the technology person, ironic. I celebrate Black history in a lot of ways. I am very intentional about it. So I actually start priming myself and my students way before February the 1st. But I do two things. I dedicate my social media to Black history. So every day I post either a saying or a quote. And so this year I decided to do animation. So I find animation quotes of our Black historians and our current future historians. I also make it a point of making sure my students get assignments that directly makes them investigate their own history as an HBCU and as African American students and non-African American students. So I try to practice it, I try to promote it, and I try to walk it every day.
Talk a little bit about the assignments that you give.
Oh, great. One assignment I did, because I do a lot, I teach freshman seminar, which is one of my favorites. So I gave them an assignment that they had to investigate and research Amanda Gorman.
Okay.
Read her poetry and then explain it. I also challenged them to read up on others. After the elections, I had an entire lecture on the power of who you are and the influence of HBCUs on the likes of Stacey Abrams, Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris, Reverend Warnock, and others. So I try to just remind them all the time that Black history is American history. And you cannot afford to walk or choose either one of them. You must do both.
Dr. Christian, same question.
Thank you. Yeah, I just will say similar things, celebrating in small and big ways and thinking about the teaching, reminding my students that Black history is made every day, right? And so the examples that were just referenced provide a good venue for that. But I also personally, just for my own edification, I pick a figure or an event and try to do some more research on it. So right now I'm reading the biography by Jeffrey Stewart of Elaine Locke, given my interest in the Harlem Renaissance. That's just a personal thing that I do. But more recently, because I had to relocate back to my hometown of Miami, Florida, because of COVID, I decided to start doing some family history this year. And I'm going to be tracing the places that my family lived in Miami over several generations by kind of identifying addresses and getting my family to talk about their memories of those different places. As I think that's the other piece that we forget sometimes, is that our own individual families are sites of Black history too. So,
Dr. Peterson.
I would repeat most of what was said here, celebrating it every day. But I try to have Black doctors. Actually, all my doctors are Black. I try to shop at Black businesses whenever I can, all year long. I'm constantly reminding my white and white adjacent colleagues, faculty, students, staff, about their anti-Blackness, and just constantly trying to acknowledge and be a champion for Black issues. And in light of what Dr. Christian just said, I just wanted to say, in terms of our family histories, I found out probably 6 months ago that my grandfather, 5 times removed, actually from North Carolina, made the pilgrimage to Liberia to decide whether or not he was going to relocate the family to Liberia. Now, he decided to come back and he sent some family members there. But so that made me on a quest for finding out more, but also wondering, okay, this man had to be exorbitantly rich. What happened to all of our wealth? So it really begins to make us question the ways in which whites have resources and how they got their resources. So
My next question is, and Dr. Gordon, you can start us off. What historical moments in our history help us understand what is going on now?
It just depends on which part of history we want to look at, especially as we look at the insurrection. I had an assignment last year that has haunted me. and it was the birth of the nation. Well, they had to watch both of them. They had to watch the birth of the nation, the original one. Then they had to watch the one on Nat Turner. And Nat Turner's insurrection has haunted me for years because of the history behind it and how he, with all of his gifts and his abilities, what his master did was farm or loan him out as a preacher to preach to the slaves biblical and theological instruction for how to behave and stay in their place. What that has done for us is that, in fact, I wrote a piece on it that I'm actually getting ready to publish, the Inappropriate Manifesto, because we have spent our lives trying to be appropriate in inappropriate situations. The insurrection itself reminded us again that as we are lectured how we behave through the Black Lives Movement, as we are told what we're doing wrong when we burn down a Target, we watch them tear up the Capitol, carrying Confederate flags, wearing anti-Semitic T-shirts from Auschwitz, and we have tried to, quote unquote, fight by staying in our place. And this has challenged us, or it has challenged me, that you need to redefine your place and your space and not allow other people to define it for you. We have tried to fight within the parameters of our oppressors' permission. And if nothing else, if we watch The Insurrectionist, we should have learned, if nothing else, you got to believe in enough of what you fight for to think outside the parameters that have already been set for you. Okay, and I know that sounds kind of radical and I'm still working through it, but there's got to be a difference as we deal with what's going on in our world and how we're planning to take it back as ours too. Not instead, not from, but to. And so I hope that answers your question. The historical moments of the Nat Turner Rebellion, the historical moments of the Civil Rights Movement, all of that play in because we see two different dichotomies. One of Nat Turner using force and one of Martin Luther King using peace. And we've got to learn now how to combat one while we seek the other.
Dr. Allen,
I hope that answers your question.
That was right on.
Okay.
Oh, was that a cue for me, Isaac?
It was.
So the panelists have set up a really nice conversation in terms of for many things to kind of pull from. So when I think about this idea of these historic moments, my mind certainly went back to Reconstruction. It went back to the Civil Rights Movement, because these were the two sort of predecessors, right, to this very moment that we find ourselves in right now. So essentially what I see this, and a talk that I did last month at my college about this, about the insurrection and MLK Day and the Biden-Harris inauguration, we're still fighting the Civil War. We are still fighting the Civil War. And the Civil War is not that Black Americans have not necessarily, the Civil War is basically whites who have not yet dealt with the idea of equality. Now, obviously, before Reconstruction, before slavery, Blacks were here on an equal footing with whites. It was only because it was convenient for them and these power structure dynamics that led to this moment that we're still dealing with decades later, hundreds of years later. So when I look at this, I say that this is really our third, and I think honestly, final opportunity to really begin to reverse this, engage in this conversation, which is why I hope Biden and Harris, and not even just Biden and Harris, right? It really is all of us, take this time and this responsibility to really educate ourselves, educate our community, but more importantly, I think it's time for whites to educate themselves about the issues that they are holding that are related to the fact that many of them have not been able to let go, and to hold their white counterparts accountable for their behavior that is inconsistent with the values of this country.
Dr. Christian, can you follow up with answering the question?
No, I mean, you can't follow Dr. Gordon and Dr. Allen. The thing that I was thinking about is we're right now in the decade that celebrates, the 100th anniversary of the Harlem Renaissance. And again, that's my little area of focus. And I was telling my students, so much of what has happened in terms of death and loss for Black people in this country over the last 10 or so years really makes me think about 1919 and, the Red Summer, this, intense period of lynching, recorded lynching at least, and how the Harlem Renaissance came out of that very intense period of racial violence. And so I tell my students to think about that history 100 years ago, and it's both exhilarating because it doesn't feel that far away because of all of what's happening now, but it's also angering and frustrating that we're still contending with the number of issues that were very much on the minds of Black America back 100 years ago. But I also encourage them to see that there's a lot of possibility that comes out of a time of racial violence and strife like we have. And so to think about, the accomplishments and the achievements of folks like Vice President Harris, but also that people are in the process of figuring out how to live and live differently. So there's a regenerative piece that happens in this time that happened in the second decade of the 20th century. So there are a lot of important parallels, I think, and even guideposts from that decade that we can be paying attention to help us understand what's happening now, in addition to the things that my colleagues have just pointed out.
What's the response from your students? You say you posed that question to them.
Yeah, well, oftentimes they're just surprised at not only how similar things are, talking about the election, for example, they were surprised to see that in the crisis, for example, there was coverage of irregular voting kind of dynamics and voter suppression here in Florida. And they were just like, wow, the same thing happened just now, a couple of weeks ago, and it happened 100 years ago. And I said, yeah, and it's been happening for a very long time. So there's a way in which the distant past is much more recent for them. And I'm able to collapse that and help them to see that we're on a continuum, right? So there's a lot of shock and surprise, but they're also surprised at how explicit Black folks were about talking about these issues in the press from that time period as well. So they're just like, wow, people are going in. I'm like, yeah, they were, because times were very, very dire, and we should probably be going in even more now. So.
Dr. Peterson.
Like Dr. Allen, and again, I'm a political scientist, so we probably think alike on a lot of these issues, but I think about the period right after Reconstruction. I think about the period right after the Civil War, the Civil Rights movement, and the way in which whites responded to the benefits, the things, the achievements of Black people. Ron Walters, in his book, he talks about this equilibrium. And he says, we have an equilibrium that we maintain in this country, which puts white supremacy above all else. And anytime we get out of whack, they remind us white supremacy runs this. And so electing Obama reminded those people who are white supremacists especially, we're out of whack. We got these uppity Negroes and we need to bring them back. And the response to electing a Black man was, we elect the total opposite, Trump. And then when we don't get our way, we're going to turn this thing out, right? And so it becomes this equilibrium that highlights white supremacy that we keep fighting to get to. Remind you, we started there. We started there. So we're still there. And every time Reconstruction begins to get us a little right, white supremacy takes over again. So that reminds me of these post periods when Black people win some achievements, responses from the government, et cetera.
Some of you guys have already, in so many ways, answered this question. Black Americans have always believed in the possibility of universal equality. How did the January 6, 2021 insurrection impact Blacks' continued belief in the American experiment? Dr. Allen?
Oh, well, honestly, it is, the insurrection is still something that I haven't fully processed. In the same way that I hadn't fully processed the tragedy, the state killing of George Floyd. These two things, because of COVID-19, because of teaching digitally and just the isolation, I've yet to really had a moment to kind of deal with that. But let's just say for the most part, if it were not for Black Americans, we would not have a democracy. So out of any group in this country who wants to preserve this idea of equality, who wants to get the country to get to a point of accepting each individual for what they have to bring, it's Black people. Black Americans want nothing more than to have the same opportunities that the whites have to utilize their own skills and their own resources. There is such an abundance of intellectual, social intelligence and economic prowess in our community that has yet to be developed. In addition to teaching here at this community college, I'm also the director of the Cuny Black Male Initiative, which is a program that's designed to provide academic support and also social emotional support and training help for Black and Hispanic men primarily, but obviously we're open to everyone who can join. We have some young ladies in the group too. But I tell them all the time about their genius. I talk to them all the time about their creativity. I talk to them all the time about their possibility. So when I look at this insurrection, it's scary because at a moment I went back and I just honestly kept thinking about the, I think it's Netflix special that talked about antebellum. Mm-hmm. And it reminded me that here we are in 2021, the audacity of the big lie. And I don't mean the big lie in terms of the election, but I mean the big lie, building off what Dr. Peterson said, the big lie of white supremacy. Mm-hmm. The big lie of white supremacy is the thing that has run this country for all these centuries. And the interesting thing about it is, if it were not for Black Americans, if it were not for Native Americans, if it was not for Hispanics, if it was not for the Asian community, where would this country be? You know, you had some representatives years ago who were saying that Black Americans had nothing to do with the building and fabrication of this country. You know, some of these people have to deny that possibility, which is why it's important for us not to pull back from these programs that talk about ethnic and racial studies. That's the problem, because these histories themselves have been removed from the conversation. You know, I was talking to a friend recently about this guy. He's a Nigerian American who's running for governor of the state of Michigan. His name is Austin. I think Chichang. I'm not really sure if I'm pronouncing the last name correctly. But here he is running on a platform that if I'm elected, I am going to declare Black History Month illegal. Mm-hmm. I'm going to make this about All American Month, All American history. Well, the problem is that through our K through 12 and to some extent even our college curriculums are not fully embracing the entire American history. They're being quite selective. You know, I grew up in the state of Alabama, and I remember we talked about Alabama history. And in Alabama history, there was not a positive or real conversation about the contributions of Black Americans to the state of Alabama. Come on. And so when I think about these things, it is our opportunity and responsibility to take these moments like the insurrection and to remind us of what the possibility is, to remind us of what Dr. King talked about. That promised land is nearby. And the thing is that we just cannot stop right now because of this moment. If anything, we have to reactivate ourselves and be clear about this and to start thinking about coalitions and rebuilding those coalitions and building those coalitions even within our own community in terms of the African diaspora, the African brothers and sisters who come here from the continent and the brothers and sisters who come here from the Caribbean as well, to understand that we are one people and that we should not be apologetic about this idea of Blackness. Because if anything, I think that's been one of the biggest problems. America needs to understand and accept the fact that we can still be Black and proud in the same way that you can be this too, without us actually hating each other. So let us understand and recognize that we have a rich and proud history. And at one point when I was growing up, just like thinking like, oh my gosh, we come from slaves. Like, yep, we did. But guess what? That's a testimony to our strength and intelligence and our wisdom, and that we have survived this and we have prospered. So January 6th is just a reminder that our fight is not over, and that I'm going to recommit myself and also my students to make sure that we can move on in this journey to help make America reach the aspiration of a full democracy.
Dr. Gordon, can you please respond to that question?
I can, and I need to confess, I had to go and remind myself what the American experience, American experiment was. Okay, because I think we have lied to ourselves for so long about this. I think even going to Colin Kaepernick's knee taking, people did not get upset because he took his knee. What I realized was people got upset because he dared to challenge an America that Black people are still being considered a guest of. Okay. So when you take a look at the American experiment that all of us are created equal, and you go back to our Constitution where we were not even created equal when it was written, there's some issues. Okay, I am the end of baby booming Martin Luther King, we shall overcome generation. And one thing the insurrection should have taught us, if it did not, was that one, as Dr. Allen has said, we have not arrived yet. But more importantly, we got to let go of some of the lies we have been taught about ourselves. Okay, because in order for one group to believe that they are better, then the other group has to somehow subscribe to the notion that we are not. Now, look, I hope you don't get in trouble, but I'm going to say this. If nothing else, we saw how stupid America could be on January the 6th. Mm-hmm. They had planned to take over the Capitol and did not have a plan as to what to do after they got it. Mm-hmm. And I kept wondering, if they had succeeded, what would they have done? Mm-hmm. You know, if you listen or watch the videos, the one guy said, well, maybe we should set up the government now. With what? You had no plan. And I think the American experience, and I'm not even calling it an experiment anymore because I'm not a guinea pig. Mm-hmm. The reality is we are equal. So we have to rewrite what we want to believe. And then we have to go about living out that life. Okay, as long as we say we want to be equal, in some way, communication wise, we're also sending out the message that we're not. Mm-hmm. And if we want to be treated equal, we got to understand what that means, because if nothing else, the insurrection and the subsequent impeachment when Trump was found not guilty, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What equal do you want to be? What equal do you want to be? Now, personally, I don't particularly want to do an insurrection, but if I could get away with it, I might think about it harder. You know, when you think about the fact that as almost 400,000 people have now died from COVID, the news report the other day said that Trump was sicker than we knew, and that one doctor had even recommended he be put on a ventilator. When we saw Trump a day or two later, he was walking, breathing, waving, and still being political. So my question was then, so what kind of drugs did he get that the other 400,000 people that died didn't get? So when we want to be equal, I think we need to be more precise what equal means to us, because we cannot have it both ways. And I'm saying, as a people of color, we say we want to be equal, but we still mistreat others as though they are not equal. We judge people based on their economy, based on their social standing, based on their zip code. So and this insurrection should have taught us that we've got to be smart. And if we're going to be smart and we honestly want this American experience or experiment to work, we've got to not just come to the table. We got to rewrite the rules so they can work. Okay. Now, you just gave a Baptist preacher a microphone, okay?
Dr. Peterson, can you share some of your thoughts on that question?
Sure, and I'll try not to be too long. But when I look at this question, I think about the possibility of universal equality is what you asked, and I'm not so sure that all Black people have ever thought that there was a possibility of equality, of universal equality. And in fact, when you look at Black people who have more money, who have higher education, they are less inclined to believe in this equality, this possibility of universal equality. Why is that? Because they did the things that we told them to do. They got educated. They make more money. And then they realize, oh, that was a bunch of trash. I did all of that and I'm still being treated the way I've been treated before. My parents thought we went into debt, all of that, because if we did these things, we would be equal. And they realize in our universities, right? In our jobs, when they have these glass ceilings, we realize that there is never this equality. Now, there's always, however, a group of Black people who believe in the politics of respectability. But even they acknowledge, that true equality is non-existent. Now, they blame the wrong people for it, but so this true all equal, universal equality stuff, the more you subscribe to their notion of how you get to be equal, the more you realize that it is, as Jennifer Hochschild says, a nightmare. It's not the American dream, it's the American nightmare.
Dr. Christian.
Thank you, Isaac. You always have me follow. I don't know that I can say anything after all that. Now, I took the question in the two parts that it was intended, because I think that, one isn't necessarily connected to the other. The insurrection for me was definitely a moment to kind of go, yeah, do I recognize that this thing is an experiment, right? Because it's being made up every day as we go. And I often chuckle at the commentary by historians, especially, who say, this is a young nation, and we need to understand that we have these, solid traditions. And that to me is a kind of contradiction, because a young nation doesn't typically have, these solid traditions, right? And January 6th reminded me of that. And as a Black person, it also made me think about, what's my place in this experiment? And Dr. Gordon mentioned this guinea pig kind of phenomena. Exactly. And we definitely need to be thinking differently about our place within that. But then, in as much as you embrace it, January 6th reminded us of all the obstacles that are in our way, have been in our way, in terms of us stabilizing and securing our place within the experiment, let alone improving it. And so I hope for Black Americans and all Americans, truthfully, it was an opportunity to reflect on what their commitment is to that experiment, because clearly there's a contingency in our country that is not interested in the experiment going forward anymore, or at least not in the way that it has. And that's to say that the experiment was flawed from the inception too, right? So that's the other thing. Do we need to scrap this whole thing altogether? So it opened up the possibilities about remaking this so-called democracy. And I'll say one quick thing about universal equality. White people don't have universal equality, right? And so I think it is an aspiration, certainly, but it has never been lived experience in human history, right? And so I don't know that me as a Black person that I want universal equality, but I certainly don't want your foot on my neck for the rest of my existence and my generation's existence, right? And so if we can't figure out a way to, as Toni Morrison would suggest, find a way to be who we are without having to put our foot on somebody else's neck, I think we got some serious challenges ahead. So the universal equality piece to me is such a distant kind of goal. I want some basic kind of changes in this country that allow people to live without the threat of violence.
My next question, what lessons can other communities learn from Black's history and accept Black history towards a more inclusive society? Dr. Peterson, can we hear from you?
Sure. And this was captured a lot by what Dr. Allen and I think Dr. Gordon was saying in the last question, which is we have to understand it's not a zero-sum game. We have to understand that me getting more doesn't mean you get less. And as we become more populated across the country, as white people become less of America, as they become a plurality instead of a majority, they're going to find more significant and substantial ways to minimize our potential power. And we've got to resist that. And that's going to be creating divisions between people who are Black, from, I'll just say African Americans, from Afro-Latinos, from people who are from Nigeria, and people who are from Ghana. And so they're going to create ways to create divisions between us. And they're also going to be very intentional in making sure that things like what happened at Georgia doesn't happen again. And so they're going to use their role in state legislatures. They're going to use their role in cities and in the governments across the country, the 50 various governments, to minimize the power that we have. So we have to be very vigilant in making sure that we don't let that happen. And the first thing they'll do to chip away at it is to create divisions. Also the divisions between Black people in terms of those who consider themselves Trumpsters and those who don't, right? They've got to understand that it's not about me individually. It's about my people as a culture, as a group, and doing things on their behalf.
Dr. Gordon, can you please respond to that question?
Question. Going back to the last question about the whole global equality, the question becomes, where do we want to go with our Black history in that? Do we maintain a Black history if global equality happens? Or does our Black history merge into just history? Okay, something to think about. But I think because we are an oral people, we've got to remember to keep telling our story and then tell our story so that others can hear the story. As I post on Facebook and other social media, I'm always surprised at the responses I get from people of color and non-people of color, I'll say it that way, who are saying, I didn't know that. Oh, you're right. We never studied that. We never learned that. And I don't even ask the question why, because I already know. But I had a situation in one of my classes a couple of years ago, whereas a student asked me, Dr. Gordon, who is this gym person that keeps popping up in the news? And I said, what gym person? And so then one student said, I don't know. And then my student said that I think his last name is Crow. And I said, Jim Crow? And so I asked the other students, can anybody tell, I'll call him John, okay? Can anybody tell John what Jim Crow was? And the student that stuck with me the most, her sentence was, isn't he that man that just did? I realized for the first time, I teach at a school in Mississippi. This student was from Memphis, and they had no idea who Jim Crow was. So if we're going to teach so that others can learn outside of our community about our history, we got to remember to teach our kids, to teach our young adults so that they can retell the history. From that, what I believe strongly is that as we look at this question, other communities will finally get the fact that since Black Americans are part of the community, our Black history is their history too. That's part of American history, part of global history. And if they understand that, we and they can take pride in what we as people of color have accomplished, and then can unlearn some of the other stories about who they said we were in the process of us doing what we did. I'm trying to get shorter in my answers. Okay.
Dr. Christian?
I'd echo Dr. Gordon in several ways. There is the primary lesson for me is that there's power in the documenting, the telling, and the sharing of our stories, right? It's healing power, it's restorative power, it's legacy building. And one of the things that, from my own personal experience, you come to learn is that when you are learning about your own history, it gives you capacity to understand and appreciate the history of others. And I think, the teaching of Black history is so, disrespected in this country, unfortunately, that it doesn't help others really come to a better understanding of their own history by not engaging in ours. You find that the more you study your history and then develop a capacity to appreciate the history of others, that our history is actually shared, right? I'm thinking a lot about the anti-Asian American violence that's happening in the country, particularly on the West Coast. And there's a lot of ways in which Asian Americans and African Americans have shared this journey around civil rights, right? And again, if you study the history, you would come to learn that and you would come to appreciate that, right? And so I feel like a major lesson again is that if you get into the habit of studying your own history, the hard and the good parts, right? And this is particularly for white Americans who tend to get a very sanitized understanding of their own history. I'm thinking about Baldwin's continual reminder that, white identity is, myth making at its best in many respects, and they're not ever confronting the truth of their history. But when you do that, you're enabling yourself a capacity to learn about and appreciate the history of others.
Dr. Allen?
Well, I feel like, coming after these three distinguished speakers, it's kind of hard to provide some additional insight. But I echo all of these comments because, they're all are true, right? I think part of this is understanding the true history of the world is really Black history. The true history of all of our evolutions is really Black history. And we have sanitized that through European conquest. We've sanitized this through the isolation of Asian, communities being isolated in these particular areas. We've isolated these things in such a way that we don't understand that the true birth of the humankind, right, is really within the context of our pigment. It is us. And so why are you interested in fighting and not understanding that all the evidence has already been pointed out there? All the evidence points to the fact that life on this earth started in the continent of Africa. And those who are from Africa look like us. And so part of this understanding that you are fighting against your origins, you are fighting against your history, and that part of this is also to understand that the only way that we can move together collectively towards whatever future that is, whatever way we want to define ourselves, whatever way we want to think about the idea of equality, or whatever those things are in terms of what we want to aspire for the development of our lives, requires us to understand and recognize that history. It requires us to pay respect to that history. And essentially what's happening right now is that there is no respect for that history. Because what has happened, I think, through European conquest and American conquest largely has been, honestly, a rewriting of history in a way that is just not accurate. And it's just never really been accurate in terms of the fullness of everything. So I think part of this understanding that, recognize that understanding more about Black history, the Black experience, is also understanding more about your pathway to freedom too.
Dr. Christian, how do you envision a Black future?
Yes. So I sat with this question quite a bit, and the place that I had landed at was that I am very, very much mindful, as I'm sure we all are, about, the 450,000, likely to be over 500,000 and 500,000 before we're turning a corner in terms of COVID, and what that has meant for Black and Brown communities. And so part of envisioning a Black future is mourning and honoring the dead. And I think for all of us, this last decade, 2010, 2020 has been intensely one of loss. And in doing that mourning and in doing that honoring, we come to a different purpose of our living, right? And that you start to understand even more that the life you're living right now is not your own. And we have to kind of rededicate ourselves to living out, an existence that takes those dreams that were snatched away, those possibilities that were denied, that existence that was ended, and carry it forth. And so I am encouraged by the loss. I know that sounds a bit ironic, but I am, in the sense that it has given me a difference in my purpose now, right? Because we've got to do better on so many levels. And so I envision a Black future by starting with the time to mourn and to honor the dead.
Dr. Gordon. We can't hear you. We still can't hear you. There you go.
Okay, you can hear me now.
We can.
So I think our future is extremely bright.
Mm-hmm.
And I am so excited and hopeful when I think about Professor Christian and just the whole Harlem Renaissance. And I believe we're having another Renaissance. I mean, it is a wonderful time to be in the hearts, to be in those gifts. And I think we as a people have made peace with a lot of things we have not been given credit for, and that we know how to survive. We know how to thrive even in pain, and we know how to live creatively. And so I think our survival skills, I mean, think about what we've been through so far as a people. I think our survival skills dictate that we have a future that will impact, that does impact and will continue to impact the world. Now, for that to happen, we're going to have to leave some of our own stuff behind as we do it. One of the big things about President Obama becoming President Obama, some were upset because they felt like he didn't do things for the Black people. Every day he woke up in the White House, he did that for us. And we've got to start seeing that some are not just ours. And we've got to let people dream new dreams that we don't even know or can imagine dreaming. But we have a great future. And I'm excited to see what happens. Our struggle and work has not be in vain. And I'll tell you what, we're going to run things, but I don't want to say that too loud because people get upset. Okay.
Dr. Peterson.
Well, I answer this question in terms of, what do I envision for the Black future? I answer it by thinking about what I am hopeful about. Right. So I'm hopeful that we will begin to be unapologetically Black, and we will love it. I am hopeful that we will have a curriculum in K through 12 and in higher education that recognizes our contributions, not just in history, but recognize that we have a place in biology. We have a place in political science. We have a place in math. We'll teach and learn about people like Benjamin Banneker. Right? Phyllis Wheatley. We'll learn the reality of Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln. And as a colleague, actually James Taylor said recently at one of our talks, we won't get lost in Abraham Lincoln's beard, that we'll understand the reality of who he was and what he represented. I'm hoping that we will shift these white paradigms that value white beauty, right? That tell us what beauty is and what success is. And we'll begin to identify it for ourselves. Where hair that looks like mine is beautiful, right? Where skin tone that's very dark is beautiful. Where girls aren't talking about taking care of those edges, but they understand the importance of being unapologetically Black and what that means. I'm hoping that we will finally get to a place where as Black people, we understand our commonality. We understand that we're all on the same team. And as long as we continue to fight on the same team, we are one powerful force that makes people look at us. Now, the drawback, unfortunately, or what I worry about is all of this awareness of Blackness is going to make people who are holding on to this white supremacy, it's going to make them act more like they did on January 6th.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so we have to do the right things throughout creating policies that protect us, et cetera, so that we don't let January 6th happen again. And we don't let it happen in Clarissa Peterson's front yard, right? And I just use me as an example, but in Black people's front yard. They should not be in the middle of Atlanta, and I just say Atlanta because it's known as a Black city, wreaking havoc on Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's the bad part of it. But again, I'm hopeful that as soon as we understand our brilliance,
Mm-hmm.
as soon as we understand how to teach things like slavery and saying that they took our kings and queens because they knew that they could build this country, that's powerful to these first, second, and third graders who are embarrassed when their classes start talking about slavery. So I don't want to talk too long because, I know my colleague, Dr. Allen, is going to bring this home.
Bring us home.
Oh my gosh, the pressure. I just want to say Isaac, thank you very much for pulling this panel together. This has been this is, I guess, part of the envisioning of Black America, right? Of our future. Is being very open and honest about these conversations, being real with them as well as being real with ourselves. It kind of reminds me, speaking of, piggybacking off what Dr. Peterson mentioned, in terms of what Toni Morrison did her entire life is, I want to be able for Black America to live in a world without the white gaze. That's what I want. That's the ultimate kind of freedom, in that we are not used this and this is not to diminish them, but it's just understand that our lives can still continue without that, without understanding that this is not in opposition to you. We have our own track, and that track is beautiful. That track, in terms of science, in terms of literature, in terms of math, in terms of everything that we have in terms of these disciplines, there has been a Black face that has made those things better, that has questioned that. We did it in psychology too, which was basically one that's been predominantly based upon whiteness. We still, as I was listening to a conversation a couple months ago that my fraternity brothers, Alpha Phi Alpha, put on in the South about it's okay not to be okay, is that I didn't realize that only that 6% of people out there are psychologists, and that not enough of the literature that's talked about the mind and mental health is actually built upon that of the Black space. So there's still a lot that we have yet to explore. So if we are still trying to understand in the context of whiteness, then we are at a loss. What we need to do is just focus on that beauty of ours, be unapologetic about our research, because obviously that's another thing that Black scholars have to worry about in terms of our research being legitimized or delegitimized because we're focused on Blackness, which is what Toni Morrison said. No, I reject that. This is not narrow. This is important. And I think it's important for us, as we all have demonstrated here, that we're going to continue to do this in our classrooms. I will continue to do this in the context of our community. And as we move forward, I think the most important thing we have to begin to remember now is that right to vote, that registration, HR1, all the protections that are in there, you have to fight for this. And you also have to start reclaiming your local and state communities too, because that's where it's going to be. Politics is local. And you have to make sure that you're actively involved in that locality and being connected with those people and being unapologetic and making sure that your tax dollars and your government works for you because it's supposed to work for you.
We have come to an end. I just want to thank the viewers and thank the panelists. For more programming, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also go to the Jersey City Free Public Library's main website and check out the calendar of events section, where you can find more panel discussions like today, more author talks, read out loud sessions, and all sorts of entertainment. Thank you guys.